Okay, let's continue with the notion of being in the world. The last little lecture, I tried to introduce that through looking at the artwork by Manet and just giving you a general sense of it. Now I want to look at some of the specifics of Heidegger's text in Being and Time. I read a little bit from, I think, section 5 before, where he says that Dasein is what is ontically closest to us, but ontologically farthest. I want to continue now with his some of his further specifications of this notion of Dasein, or the there being. That's the word he's using to try to describe what it's like to be us, what our very way of existing is, which he also calls being in the world. So I want to turn. Well, actually, I want to continue first with, it was section 5, and I want to continue with a little piece of section 5. This is on page 37. So, we have theories about ourselves. Maybe you take sociology classes and they tell you stuff about what people are like, or maybe you go to church and you have some belief about how man was created in the image of God, or something like that. Or maybe you go to physics class. I don't even know what, but or whatever, psychology class. You have your views about what we are, but those are views. Those are theoretical views. Those are views that they're ways of interpreting. They're views you've come to develop based on, I guess, thinking and evidence and whatever else you have. Through those experiences and studies and whatever else, you've come to develop a view about what you are. Might be right or it might be wrong. That's not my point. My point isn't whether it's right or wrong. My point is what kind of thing it is, right? It's a theory about yourself. And so in Being in Time, we're doing phenomenology, which means basically the attempt to describe experience in the very form in which it is lived. So we don't want any theories. We're not interested in your or anybody else's theories about what we are. We want to get to know ourselves by accurately giving an account of what it is like for our reality as experiencing beings to unfold. So we don't want to turn to our theoretical reflections about ourselves. We want to turn to the description of our living experience. And for that reason also, we don't want to look at what it's like to be ourselves in some very specialized situation. You can, let's say you had a theory about yourself, that you are a thinking being, maybe borrowing something from Descartes. And you can then put yourself in a position of thinking. You can sit there and say, okay, I'm going to think about something. So you're thinking about something, and in doing that, you can say, yeah, see, this is what kind of thing I am. I'm a thinking being. But what you've done is, again, that doesn't automatically mean you're wrong, but just look at what kind of thing you've done. You've put yourself in a special state. And then you're looking at that special state and saying, this is what I am. It's kind of like a chemistry experiment, where you take some soil sample and you put heat on it and some pressure on it, and you mix it with some liquid, and you titrate the liquid and do whatever else, and you get some result. And you say, oh, this is what it is. Yeah, maybe in some sense that's what it is. But notice, you're not just answering what dirt is. You're looking at what dirt is when you subject it to all these things and do all these specialized things to it. May still be an important result, but the thing you ended up getting was dirt as subjected to various things. Well, the same thing happens if you like say, okay, now I'm going to think. Right? You're taking your existence and you're putting it in some specialized state and studying it. We don't want to look at that. Oh, we do want to look at that in general, but we don't want to look at that as if that were going to give us a kind of unbiased, straightforward view about just what kind of thing we always are. No, what we want to do is we want to look at the way our experience normally unfolds, precisely the way it unfolds when we're not thinking about it, which is what I was trying to get at when we looked at that Manet painting. We want to try to describe the form our experience takes in its average everyday character. And so that's what Heidegger says at the bottom of page 37. He says, we want to find a way that the entity we're studying, ourselves, can, as he says, show itself in itself and from itself. It's this convoluted way of saying can show us what it is. And he says, and this means that it must be shown as it is proximally and for the most part. So proximately means in the way that is closest, and for the most part means usual. So in other words, we want to look at it in its average everydayness, right? That's what we're going to do, and so we're going to try to describe what it is to be there, to undergo the happening of experience, which is what we all are doing all the time, which is what we all are all the time. We are the undergoing of the happening of there is, right? We're going to describe that in the way it happens in its everydayness. So I just wanted to read you that line from 37 and 38. Let's skip ahead a little bit to section 9. Section 9 is another good one to read. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to give you a couple of lines from it right now. Everything up to there has been his introduction to the book. Now he's sort of getting going a bit. It takes Heidegger a while to get going. First time I read this book, I read it. I was going to take a course in it, and I decided I would read the book through before I took the course, just so I could get a sense of what was there, so that I could really study it. And so I read it through on my own, and I did that with a few books. And in fact, it's a very good strategy with some books sometimes, and with this one it turned out to be good. But what I found is I was reading it, and thought, what the heck is this guy talking about? I didn't really know, and I had some background in philosophy. But even in Continental philosophy, but I didn't really know what was going on. I read a lot of stuff, a lot of things like showing itself in itself and from itself, and I thought, what's he talking about? And I really was struggling. I thought, am I ever going to understand this? And it's when I got somewhere around, I think, 120 pages in. Let me see where section 12 is. Maybe around section 16, somewhere between about 100 and 120 pages in. When I'd read that stuff, which is what I'm going to try to get us to here, that's when I suddenly thought, oh, that's what he's talking about. And then a lot of it made sense. So be aware of that. It's possible that what I've said already makes more sense to you than it did to me when I read it the first time. But I'm just trying to skip through a few little pieces here at the beginning to set us up so that when I can then talk about that stuff around pages 100 to 120 or something like that, where I think the real meat of this will really start to become clear. But anyway, let me read this thing from section 9, which is a helpful section to read. We are ourselves the entities to be analyzed. Remember that. We're asking what we are. That's what we want to know. And notice we're doing that as a philosophical inquiry. But in doing that, actually, we're doing something that well, first of all, we're doing something that's possible for us. My cat can't do that, right? We are the kind of being for whom it is possible to ask, what am I, right? And also, in doing that philosophically, I think we're doing something that is a more refined and developed version of something that most people probably do some version of most of the time, right? There's a basic way in which we do wonder about what kind of thing we are. I mean, maybe we feel like we get that answer settled to our satisfaction, then we don't think about it too much anymore, and then maybe you know those people and they make fun of you for taking philosophy classes or whatever. But I think most of us at some point have grappled with those kinds of questions. I have a 4-year-old son, and I think he in different ways grapples with that kind of thing. So I think in a way it is a kind of a human question. What am I? Which isn't just asking what is my name. Like you're trying to figure out what kind of thing am I. But as Heidegger said, we typically appeal to, for lack of a better word, in the everyday sense, a kind of scientific attitude, the kind of attitude that studies objects in the world. And he's going to say we typically do that and miss what we should do, which is to notice about ourselves that this distinctive reality of being experiencing subjects, and which brings with it the need for quite a different set of terms than the ones we use to analyze objects. Anyway, but let me just continue. We are ourselves the entities to be analyzed. And so the being of any such entity is in each case mine, right? So one of the things is that the very nature of being a subject is whoever the subject whatever subject it is, for that subject, it experiences that as a me, as a mine. Let me try to say that a little bit more clearly, what I mean by that. I'm trying to bring out roughly that idea of subjectivity, and it's integral to what it is like to be a subject, to have that subjectivity, have the meaning, oh, this is my perspective, this is me. Right? Mineness is not a incidental fact about it. This happens to be mine, that happens to be yours. Mineness is part of the very meaning of what it is to be a subject. Right? That's part of the that's almost you could say a structural characteristic of subjectivity, is that it has the characteristic of mineness. And so then he says, these entities, subjects, in their being comport themselves towards their being, right? Yeah, that's a version of the thing I was actually just saying a minute ago. Precisely because the very nature of our experience is always, the nature of our experiencing is always given as mine. It's always experienced as I'm having this experience. Not that you say that to yourself reflectively, but that you have a living sense of yourself as the one who is experiencing. Because mineness characterizes your very being, that means, in a way, the issue of me or mine, of I and what I am is sort of intrinsically raised by the experience of being a subject. And for that reason, our own being, our own reality is always implicitly at play, in question, at issue in our experience. And so he says these entities in their being comport themselves towards their being, like it's in the very nature of our experiencing to have a meaningful orientation to the fact of this being a me, right? And he says, as entities with such being, as beings of, because we're that type of thing, we are delivered over to our own being, right? We're basically exposed. That's the language that I use in my book, Sites of Exposure. We're basically exposed to ourselves. And then he also says, being is that which is an issue for every such entity. So it's interesting that two things. It's just a short paragraph, but he brings out two things which he explores in more detail elsewhere, but I'm just trying to bring them out of a few sentences. If we look at this situation of experiencing, like when you find yourself looking at that server in the Folie Légère, in the Manet painting, yes, you're noticing her and you're noticing the beer and whatever else, but implicit in that noticing is the awareness that you are noticing, right? So even as your perspective puts you out into the world, it also, in so doing, is always announcing implicitly that it is your perspective, that this is you seeing, right? And so the issue of your own being is always already alive in your perspective. You don't have to invent it. It's already there, right? And also, being as such is what is at issue for us, in that, again, part of what it is to be the kind of being that we are is we are always asking the question, what is? And we ask that question at every level, from the most immediate, what is this thing? Oh, it's a Bass Ale, I think is maybe what's one of those beers is in that painting. But to the ultimate question, what is the nature of reality, or what is reality itself, right? We are attuned to that issue of the being of something, which is why we can ask what kind of thing I am. We can say, how does a subject differ from an object? We to the fact that we can ask that question about ourselves. I'm saying ask it explicitly. Well, let's stick with that. The fact that we can ask it explicitly is because we're the kind of people, we can ask that question about ourselves because we're the kind of being who can ask that question about being, period. We're so constituted as to have that issue alive for us in the way, again, that my cat presumably is not so constituted. But yeah, I said we asked that issue explicitly, but the further point is that we are always asking that in a way implicitly. It's always intrinsically and implicitly an issue for us, who am I? And it's always implicitly an issue for us what reality is. And at some level, we've always answered those questions. We operate with a kind of lived sense of what it is to be the thing that I am in the world. What there is, right? And so Heidegger actually will call that a pre-ontological grasp of being. In other words, ontological meaning, sort of having a interpretation of being. Well, we are ontologists. We're philosophers in principle, in the sense that we have views about what being is, but they're pre-ontological, which is to say, they're implicit, non-reflective ways we have already come to conclude something about the nature of reality without even explicitly thinking about it. Anyway, that's you'll see him say more of those things. I'm just reading that first paragraph on number 9. Anyway, so now at the bottom of that page, what page is this actually? It's 67. Section 9 begins on 67. So I was reading the first paragraph on 67. And now at the end of that, I'm going to skip the next couple of paragraphs, but near the bottom of the page, number 2, he says, that being which is an issue for this entity is in it. Sorry. That being which is an issue for this entity in its very being is in each case mine. Thus, this is going to go back to the thing I was saying when I was talking about your living experience versus seeing yourself reflected in the mirror in that painting. He says, thus Dasein, the kind of thing that you are, the human being, the there being, the in the world being. Thus Dasein is never to be taken ontologically, right? Never to be taken in its ultimate character as a type of existence. Dasein is never to be taken ontologically as an instance or special case of some genus of entities as things that are present at hand. In other words, what you are is not just another instance of Homo sapiens. To entities such as these, their being is a matter of indifference. Because Dasein has in each case mindness, one must always use a personal pronoun when one addresses it. I am, you are, you're a who. I'm not going to explore that further. I just wanted to read it through for you. I hope you got some sense. I'm just going to say one thing about it, then I'm going to skip ahead to section 12. I think he's basically trying to say in a kind of condensed way the thing I was saying about mindness, right? In as much as it is the very character of being a subject that it is intrinsically always a matter of being mind. You're not just an indifferent instance of a certain kind of thing. For every subject, you are really the one. Your kind of existence is uniquely different from anything else you encounter, because it's the one where you're happening at the center of it. The mindness of your experience is not an accidental secondary feature added onto it. It's integral to the very meaning of what it is to be experiencing. And so uniqueness, in that sense, is integral to its very meaning. Let me just skip on. I just want to read those paragraphs to you. There's actually quite a bit more in section 9 that's good. And let me add, it's a little bit dense. Everything he says in that, he says elsewhere in the book in greater detail. Section 9 is kind of a thing that gives you a quick view of some of the things that are going to be talked about. So I recommend you to read it, because you get some good stuff there. But it's not the kind of thing where you have to worry if you think, I don't know why he's saying this, and he hasn't talked about this very much. He hasn't really defended this. That's what he's going to spend the rest of the book doing. But it gives you a quick view of a few points. Anyway, let's skip ahead and get to the real thing. So I said we're being in the world. Well, let's talk about what that means. He says we're being in the world. And that was the expression I used. Well, I intentionally used his expression to try to capture something of what I was describing when I was looking at that painting and trying to talk about what it's like to be there. And I was saying we're situated, and we're situated in a way that I don't experience myself as one thing in the world over here, and then there are other things in the world over there, which is more like the perspective one has when one looks at one's reflection up in the corner of the mirror. Rather, I am not a separate thing from all those things. I'm sort of the meaning of that whole perspective, and I kind of disappear from view, and all that is present to me in my experience normally is all of that stuff that makes up the situation, where the very meaning of that is how it has a charged sense for me, such that it is carrying on the meaningful flow of my experience, something like that. Um, uh, that's my attempt quickly to summarize the kinds of things I was talking about in that first little lecture. Anyway, I said that's what we want to get at when we give the name being in the world to the kind of thing we are. What it is to be a subject is to have that experience of being thrown out into something. Right? So that's what we want to talk about. So Heidegger says, when we give the name being in the world to our experience, we're treating it as a unitary phenomenon. And that's what I'm trying to get at when I'm saying this isn't separated off from this and this. This thing comes as a whole. But he says even though it's a whole, it still has some determinate dimensions, almost like a kind of structure. So I say being in the world. Well, we can look at this whole thing and we can look at it to highlight this or that aspect of it. And he wants to have one of the big ones he wants to emphasize that I want to pick up on here is this notion of being in. So he says, what is meant by being in? This is on page 79. What is meant by being in? And he says, usually we think of in as we think of two entities extended in space. So water and glass are both in space, and the water is in the glass. The garment is in the cupboard, etc., etc. The bench is in the lecture room. Like that's often what we think of in as meaning. But that's not what the in of being in the world is like. So if you think of the water in the glass, you've got two things that are spatially defined, and this thing is contained by the space there, etc., etc. But remember what we're talking about. We're talking about how you are being in the world when we're describing your experience. There, being in the world means being wrapped up in it and being alive to it, being situated in it, right? None of those things characterize the water that's in the glass, right? So as he says a little bit further, not changing. Well, actually, let me read a little bit more here. He says, being in, is the 4 lines up from the bottom of 79. Being in is a state of Dasein's being. It's our way of existing. And he says it is an existentiale. That's a word he's going to use. That's the singular. The plural would be existentialia. And notice this is spelled T-I-A-L. You're going to see another word that he spells T-I-E-L-L, and that's kind of the opposite. So it's good to know that. Anyway, so he's saying this is an existential dimension of our existence. And what he means by that is, it characterizes our very way of existing. So it's something that is never not a part of our experience, since it's the very structure and very meaning of experience. So he says, when we talk about it this way, he says, we can't think of this as the being present at hand of some bodily thing in an entity that is also present at hand, like the water is in the cup. He said, nor does the term being in this context mean, the same thing, one in another, etc., etc. Blah 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 blah. He said in this. He then looks a little bit at the etymology of the word in. That's not so important to us. The etymological sense isn't so important to us. What he says on the basis of it is what's important to us. He says in is derived from the word to reside or to dwell, and it's related to the word that means I am accustomed or I am familiar with. And so basically that's what he says. He says, the in that characterizes our being in the world is the in of inhabiting. So you have to think about what it's like to be, um, to inhabit something. So being in the world is more like saying being at home in the world. And as he says, we think of it as being familiar with, and so on. So, um, I want you to think about what it's like to be at home, because that's the fundamental reality of inhabiting. And he's saying that's the core meaning of what it means when we say to be in the world. So when he says we're being in the world, that doesn't mean we're a water inside a cup. It means we inhabit the world. We relate to the world in the sense of being at home in it. I'll show you another image here, just because I think it captures something. This is a Jeff Wall image from I think 2004 and 2005, and it's called View from an Apartment. Again, I'm not going to talk about it in any particular detail, and interesting as it would be to be doing philosophy of art, that's not our purpose here now, at least. But I want to use this image because I think it helps to capture something. Like in an image like this, you can see something about stuff you're familiar with, and you can see like that's you can either imagine yourself as one of the people in that picture, or you can imagine yourself as a third person who's in the other side of the room looking at those people, right, where your perspective would be the same as the camera's. It doesn't matter. The thing I really want you to think about is what it's like to be there. So these are people at home, and the person on the couch, I think, is particularly interesting. Look at the way she's just sort of flopped on the couch, reading something. The couch becomes a place where you relax. You go home and you flop down on it. And just as I was saying before, that when you're talking to that woman in the bar in that Manet painting, in the normal sense, you're not really aware of your own body. You're aware of what's outside you, but you are kind of hidden from yourself. The interesting thing here is that when this woman flops down on the couch is kind of hidden from her too. You might be looking at the woman at the bar and be really interested in her and engaged with her, and so focused on talking with her, right? So it's very explicitly and thematically obvious in your experience that that's what's going on. When this woman is sitting on the couch, that couch is not an object for her. In fact, where is her attention? Her attention is on whatever is happening in the story that she's reading about in that magazine, right? So if you could make a Manet painting from inside her perspective, I guess you could have a picture of her looking at the words on the page of the newspaper she's reading instead of looking at the waitress at the bar. But even that would be wrong, because if you think about what it's like to read, like she's not saying, oh, there's a letter T and there's a letter O and there's a letter L or something. She's not looking, there's a straight line and there's a cross line. She's reading, which means those words on the page are kind of similar, like her own body and like the couch, they're kind of disappearing from her view. And she's wrapped up in the story of, I don't know whether she's reading a soap opera story about someone's romance, or whether she's reading a political analysis of some protest, or whether she's reading the latest art installation by someone. Who knows what she's reading? But whatever she's reading, the thing that is the subject matter of that piece of writing is what she's noticing. And the words on the page, the printed text, is receding into the background of her perception, just like her hands holding the magazine are, and just like her back on the couch is, and just like the couch itself is, right? All of those things are slipping away into that hidden, non-explicit realm that's sort of on her side of things, so that the object of her attention can absorb her. And so I wanted to look at her in this picture because I think that's a pretty good image of what it's like to be at home. When you're at home, the things of your world function pretty much like the way your body does. normally, right? In the sense that it disappears to allow some object to appear. Um, so, look around the rest of the apartment. Think of the way the woman who's walking relates to her socks. Um, you know, if there's a bunch of stuff thrown on some chairs there, like maybe it's kind of messy, they might or might not notice that. The ironing board is out by the kitchen table. Like that's how people inhabit their spaces. They're often cluttered and so on, because they're spaces for living. And one of the things that's interesting is that sometimes people don't even really notice the clutter because they live from the space rather than looking at it. And it's interesting too. This is a house and it has a window out on the world, and the window lets you see the world, but it also keeps the rain and the wind out, and it sort of emphasizes that your house is a little shelter from that exposure to all the demanding, challenging things out there. It's just a way of helping to remind you of the sense of home as a place of comfort and retreat from the whatever else in the world might be alien and demanding and really indifferent to you. Like that world out there of the docks and probably the weather. Like they don't care about the weather. Doesn't care about these people, and the whatever the industries are on the docks don't care about these people. That's a world that's completely indifferent to who these individuals are. But their home is not that. Their home is sort of built around them, and it's part of what lets them be themselves, right? And so, in a few different senses, you can't really separate who either of these people is from the little bit of the world they're in there. So anyway, that's just me riffing a little bit, giving a few reflections on the image and the painting to get you thinking about what it's like to be at home, to inhabit a place, and especially then to notice that when you inhabit a place, the kind of relationship that you have to things in the world is not like the relationship when you have when you look at something as an object. And indeed, the things that make up your home are more like aspects of your subjectivity than they are like objects. They're on your side of reality more so than they're on the alien side of reality. So that's part of what it means to be in the world and to inhabit it. Again, in Sites of Exposure, I'm trying to make that same point, right? So what I call lesson 1 brings out this basic theme about subjectivity. And lesson 2 sort of enhances that a bit, talking about something like that notion of mindness and the way in which the sense of self is experienced in the world, and it's kind of inseparable from the way in which the itness or the there-isness of the world is experienced. But then especially in lesson 4, I start talking about the notion of home, trying to show how it's integral to our experience at just about every level that we live from an experience of being at home in some part of the world, in some aspect of the world. So I want to give you that as a core sense of what being in is. So that's the second thing that I wanted to do, and I'm gonna pause there because I really just wanted to introduce some of these basic ideas about Dasein, especially up to this point of saying what being in is as inhabitation, and bringing out this idea that our relationship to the world at the most basic level is one of being at home in it. So I'm going to pause there, and then the last lecture in this little 3-lecture unit is going to explore a little bit more of that difference between being at home with something and having it as an object.